April 14th, 1912, 11:39 p.m. North Atlantic Ocean. A lookout named Frederick Fleet peers into the darkness from the crow's nest of the largest ship ever built. No binoculars, they were somehow left behind in Southampton. Just his eyes, straining into a moonless, mirror-calm sea. 1 minute later, he rings the bell 3 times and shouts into the telephone, "Iceberg, right ahead." The officer on the bridge throws the wheel hard to port. The engines reverse. But at over 46,000 tons moving at full speed, the Titanic cannot stop in time. The Iceberg scrapes along the starboard side. 6 watertight compartments buckle and flood. The ship can survive 4. 6 means she is already dead. 2 hours and 40 minutes later, 1,517 people are gone. But what if Fleet had spotted that iceberg 60 seconds earlier? What if the binoculars had been packed? What if the Titanic had simply arrived in New York on April 17, 1912, as scheduled to champagne, confetti, and front-page headlines? What changes? More than you think. And some of it is dark. Here is the first uncomfortable truth about a Titanic that never sinks. It becomes forgotten. Not immediately, the maiden voyage of the world's largest ship would still be celebrated. But within a year, the German ocean liner Imperator would launch, larger and even more lavishly equipped. The Titanic would settle into routine Atlantic crossings, competing with sister ships, carrying immigrants and millionaires back and forth across the ocean until the economics stopped making sense. By the Great Depression, the White Star Line, already in financial trouble, would likely have sold or scrapped the ship. One alternate history analyst put it plainly. Titanic would have been scrapped in the 1930s, joining her sister ships in an unremarkable death, remembered only by maritime specialists. No documentaries, no blockbuster films, no cultural mythology, just another old boat, dismantled for steel. The most famous ship in history becomes a footnote. Now here is where the alternate timeline gets genuinely interesting, because the Titanic didn't just take 1,517 ordinary lives. It took some of the most powerful people in the early 20th century world. John Jacob Astor IV. At the time of his death, his net worth was equivalent to roughly $2.9 billion in today's money. He was 47, in prime health, with decades of investment and influence ahead of him. He had already shown interest in aviation technology. A living Astor reshapes American real estate, finance, and possibly early aviation in ways we can only guess at. Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to one of America's great mining and industrial fortunes. He dressed in his finest clothes as the ship went down, and was last seen sitting in a deck chair, sipping brandy, telling a steward, "We are dressed in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." His daughter Peggy Guggenheim went on to become one of the most important art patrons of the 20th century. Imagine what that family's cultural influence looks like with Benjamin still at its head, directing its industrial wealth for another 30 years. Isidor Straus, co-owner of Macy's, who refused to board a lifeboat before other men. His wife Ida refused to leave his side, telling him, "As we have lived, so will we die together." Both gone, these were not passive passengers. These were people whose money and decisions shaped companies, funded charities, influenced elections, and built institutions. Every one of them missing from history is a stone thrown into still water, with ripples we cannot fully trace. Here is the most important consequence of a Titanic that never sinks, and the one most people never consider. The Titanic was fully compliant with every maritime regulation that existed in 1912. It carried 16 lifeboats, exactly as many as the law required for a ship its size. The regulations were calculated not by the number of people aboard, but by the ship's tonnage. The result was that the lifeboats could hold roughly half the people on board. Before the Titanic, nobody important enough to change the rules had died because of that gap. After the Titanic, the entire world suddenly cared very much. In 1914, 13 nations convened in London and signed the first International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea Solus. It required ships to carry enough lifeboats for every single person aboard. It required 24-hour radio watches. It created the International Ice Patrol, which has monitored North Atlantic icebergs every year since its founding and has never lost a single life within its surveillance zone. Without the Titanic sinking, Solus doesn't happen in 1914. The shipping industry had been arguing against expensive lifeboat requirements for years. Without 1,517 deaths to answer for, they probably win that argument for decades longer, which means the next major maritime disaster, and there would have been one, happens to a ship that also doesn't carry enough lifeboats, and the one after that, the death toll of the Atlantic shipping lanes in a world without the Titanic sinking, could, paradoxically, be far higher than the 1,517 who died on that cold April night. There is one more thread worth pulling. In May 1915, the British ocean liner Lusitania was torpedoed by a German submarine off the coast of Ireland. Nearly 1,200 people died, including 128 Americans. The outrage over civilian deaths at sea was a significant step in shifting American public opinion toward entering World War I. In a world where the Titanic never sank and Solus never passed, the radio regulations and maritime communication networks are weaker. Does a different ship meet that fate? Do the Americans get drawn into the war differently or later? The connection is not a straight line, but it exists. And then there is the cultural loss. In 1997, James Cameron released a film called Titanic. It became the highest-grossing movie in history at the time, won 11 Academy Awards, and introduced an entire generation to the story of the ship. Celine Dion's My Heart Will Go On became one of the most recognized songs on Earth. None of that exists. This sounds trivial compared to lives lost and regulations delayed. But the Titanic myth, the hubris of man versus nature, the class divisions of who survived and who didn't, the nobility and cowardice of those final hours, became one of the defining moral stories of the 20th century. It shaped how people think about technology, arrogance, and disaster preparedness. Without it, something else fills that space. But what? A Titanic that never sinks saves 1,517 lives on one April night and gives history back some of the most powerful individuals of the early 20th century. It is, on its face, an unambiguous good. But it also delays the maritime safety revolution that those deaths forced. It removes from history a disaster so shocking, so visible, and so well documented that governments had no political choice but to act. In the cold arithmetic of history, the lives saved by Solus across a century of safer ships, better lifeboats, and constant radio watches may number in the tens of thousands. The Titanic is perhaps history's most brutal example of a truth that recurs again and again. Sometimes the disasters that feel like pure tragedy are also the ones that force a civilization to finally fix what it was too comfortable to fix before. The iceberg that sank the Titanic also saved an uncountable number of people who never knew they were in danger. If you could go back and save the Titanic knowing what it cost, would you? Drop your answer below.